Hey, Econ 200. This week we're talking about equilibrium from Chapter 4 of your textbook. In Chapter 3, we discussed supply and demand, but in that chapter, the supply curve and the demand curve were kept separate from each other. We just thought about each of them independently. In Chapter 4, we're going to put supply and demand together, and we're going to think about the interaction of consumers' decisions and sellers' decisions and how that works out in a market setting. Okay, now when we graph these, remember that the demand curve is downward sloping, right? That means that as you reduce the price, buyers are going to want to purchase more and more units of a good. And the demand curve is organized so that the highest valued uses of the good come first, and then the intermediate valued uses, and finally the lowest valued uses. If this was, I don't know, let's say the market for smartphones, for example, people up here would probably be, well, a lot of college students and younger people place very high value on their smartphones. Also, people who do a lot of business, right? Businessmen and women, entrepreneurs who need to be able to stay in constant contact with customers and have a lot of information close at hand easily. That's going to be up here. As you move down the demand curve, you're going to run into people who are more like me, right? Middle-aged folks who need a phone to keep in touch with people. But if I didn't have a smartphone, if I was just back to having a cellular phone, I could get by with that. I do prefer my smartphone because it has all the extra bells and whistles, but I don't value it so much more than a cell phone the way a lot of people do. And then eventually you get down to this area where people don't have a very high value for say a smartphone. This would include my grandmother, for example, who is 93 years old and still uses a rotary phone at her house. Not sure if you guys have ever seen a rotary phone, but that's the one that they have a dial or a disc on the front of the phone, and you put your finger into it and you crank it to dial the individual numbers. Okay, she is not interested in owning a smartphone at all, and she never will be. So you would have to set the price really, really low in order to get her to buy one. In fact, in the case of my grandmother, you'd probably have to pay her. So the demand curve would actually be below $0 here if she was going to get a unit. Okay. On the other hand, the supply curve is upward sloping. And that just tells us that as the price increases for a good, sellers are going to be more eager to sell. They will offer you more units the higher the price that you allow them to charge. Okay, and that also means that we're organizing the supply curve by the lowest cost units first, and then intermediate cost units, and then more and more expensive units. Okay. Now, if you look at these two curves together, you'll notice that they cross in the middle. And that crossing, that intersection point, is very important in this class and in the analysis of markets. That point is the first place where, or it's the only place, where the cost to the seller to produce the good is exactly the same as the value that the customer who purchases it has. In other words, this seller and this buyer both place exactly the same dollar value on that unit of the good. To the left of this intersection, you'll notice that the buyer who's purchasing the good values each unit more than the seller who is selling that particular unit of the good. Okay? What does that tell you? That tells you that in all of these transactions over here, there are available gains from trade. Right? There is surplus that can be captured. So let's say that is $100, and this unit clearly is at $0. So there would be $100 of surplus available, and how much of that surplus went to the buyer and how much went to the seller would depend on where they struck the price. If they set the price at $75, then the buyer would get $25 of surplus. The seller would get $75 of surplus. If they split it down the middle at $50, at a $50 price, each of them would get $50 of surplus, and so on. And so this area to the left, I'm going to highlight in green. And make a note that these are the welfare enhancing transactions. Now, to the left of this intersection, you'll see that the opposite is the case. Now, the cost to the sellers to produce the units is greater than the value to the consumers who would be purchasing the units or who would be getting their hands on the product. Okay? And so these are transactions that we actually do not want to see happen because it would represent a waste of resources. Over here, the sellers are taking some value of resources, labor, raw materials, time, rent, land. They're taking those resources and they're turning them into a product. And the supply curve on this side, it being below the demand curve, tells us that the cost of the resources is less than the value that the consumers get from the finished product. So over here, value is being created. Value is being added to those resources, right? We're taking them and we're combining them in such a way that it improves the usefulness of those resources to humanity. On this side of the graph, notice that the cost in terms of resources is greater than what people would get out of the product that you're making out of those resources. So over here, you're wasting society's scarce resources, and we would not want to see any of these transactions happen. So I'm going to shade that side in red. And make a note that these are the welfare reducing transactions. That means that ideally, the number of trades or the number of transactions we want to see in a market is going to be the quantity of units consistent with where supply and demand intersect. I'm going to call that Q star, right, to represent that as the best level or the optimal level of output. Okay. Now, through the 20th century, a big part of the economic debate came down to what's the best way of trying to make sure that this happens, that we get the optimal quantity of units traded in a particular market and in all markets generally. And there were basically two answers to this question that people posed. One is what you would call maybe central planning. Okay. The other is what you might call private action or private enterprise. With central planning, essentially what you've got is a small group of people, a relatively small group of experts, who go out and try to figure out what would be the best allocation of resources. Who should produce a product? Who should get to receive that product? How many of each type of product should be produced, and so on. Private enterprise instead says, no central planning agency. Instead, just let individuals choose for themselves. If somebody wants to sell in a market, they're free to produce and try to sell in that market. If people want to purchase a good, they're free to purchase a good. And we will allow the individual decisions of everybody in society to determine what gets produced by whom and who purchases it, who gets to consume what is produced. Okay. Now I say central planning versus private enterprise in terms of like the Cold War lingo. You're probably more familiar with the terms like communism or socialism versus capitalism or free markets. Okay, but the basic difference between those worldviews is essentially who should decide. Should it be a centralized body that sort of top-down organizes an economy, or should the decision rights be widely dispersed among lots of people so that it's more of a bottom-up, less governed process? Okay. Now, we basically ran that experiment in the 20th century, starting in probably about the late 19-teens, early 1920s, and running through to about the 1990s, early 1990s. And effectively, what we found with that experiment was those countries, those economies that relied heavily on central planning, the Soviet Union, Communist China, North Korea, Cuba, Eastern Europe, they tended to do a pretty poor job of producing goods that people wanted and producing them at high quality and low cost. By comparison, those countries that used private enterprise instead, the United States, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, different a few areas of the Middle East, they did comparatively better. Okay, their economies grew faster. They suffered fewer shortages. They didn't run into kinds of problems that people ran into with central planning. One fairly common aspect with a centrally planned economy in the 20th century was mass starvation. It happened in the Soviet Union when they collectivized agriculture. Somewhere around 4 million people starved to death in the Ukraine. In North Korea, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when North Korea didn't have access to Soviet grain anymore, at least heavily subsidized Soviet grain, a big famine broke out in North Korea, killed somewhere on the order of 250,000 to 500,000 people. China, during Great Leap Forward and their attempts to collectivize agriculture, lost somewhere between 30 million and 50 million people to famine as well. Whereas nothing on that order of catastrophe occurred, at least economic catastrophe, occurred in those countries that relied on private enterprise. Now, why is it that central planning didn't work out particularly well? There's two main reasons. One is the information problem. And one is the incentive problem. The information problem is the fact that any economy that's, bigger than a couple hundred people becomes very complex. If you have an economy like the United States, where there's a population of 330 million people or so, and about 2/3 of those people are working, and there's who knows how many different thousands of products that can be produced, you've got a real problem trying to figure out who should get each product, how should we produce that product, what resources should go into making that product, and how much of each product should we produce relative to others. Okay, so for example, if you were to if you were to rip open a wall in your house to look for the electrical work, you would find, for example, that the wires are all made out of copper. Okay, now it turns out that copper is really not the best material for conducting electricity. Gold is a much better metal for conducting electricity. It has a lot more electrons. A gold atom has more electrons. It's more efficient at that. And it's also actually easier to draw into wire than copper is. Okay, but gold is much more rare than copper is. And if you were to take all of the gold that has ever been mined in human history, it would fill up, I believe, one Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's it. That's all the gold. That's not just all the gold that we have to work with. That's all the gold that we have ever had to work with. Okay, now obviously that number goes up. That amount goes up a little bit every year as we mine more gold out of the ground. But the point is, it's very rare. Copper, on the other hand, not as great a material, but it's very, very abundant. Okay, we can harvest or mine tens of thousands of tons of copper every year, and there's still plenty to go around. Okay, now if you are a central planner, you have to decide not just for those two resources, but for every resource, raw material that you can possibly think of, what is the best place to put that resource to use. And so the idea that a small number of people can intelligently design an economy in a way that serves everybody very well turns out to be pretty naive. Okay, small groups of people are just not that good at planning extraordinarily complicated systems like an economy. And then you also have an incentive problem, which is ideally what we want is people. If you had a central planner who knew everything, you would want that person to be benevolent, right? So that he or she would want to make sure that these are the consumers who get the product and that these are the sellers who produce the product. However, any group of people or any individual who has enough power within an economy to centrally plan it generally has the incentive to make sure that they get as many resources as possible, and that their close friends and family get as many resources as possible, and beyond that, that their supporters get as many resources as possible. And making sure that you and those you care about are as well taken care of as possible is usually not conducive to making sure that the economy is operating as efficiently as possible. So central planning does not work out particularly well. Private enterprise, as I pointed out, has a much better track record at fulfilling human wants. And it's worth considering how is that possible, because you've got a really complicated system in an economy. A small group of individuals, they're not going to be great at what would you say, rationalizing that system and planning it out so that everybody gets what they need. But then why should we trust a bunch of individuals who aren't experts and aren't coordinated? Why would it be the case that they might be able to do a better job of allocating resources? So to think about that, or to understand why private enterprise might work better, we need to think about the role of prices in a market. Okay, so we've got our supply and demand curve. This is the quantity of units that we want to trade at that intersection of supply and demand. And now consider what would happen in terms of voluntary action if the market could get the price exactly right. And by exactly right, I mean, let's say that we get a price right here that cuts through that intersection of supply and demand. Okay, so that's our price. Now, what would this be telling consumers and producers? Well, the price tells consumers this is how much you have to pay to get this product. This is what you have to give up in order to get the item that you want. Okay? So if you were a consumer along this demand curve, when would you be willing to purchase the unit? Well, you'd only be willing to purchase the unit if your value for it, if your maximum willingness to pay was greater than the price that you were being required to pay. And now, take a look at this. If we look along that side of the demand curve, we can see that the willingness to pay of these consumers is greater than the price that they're being charged, right? So all of these consumers, all the way up to where the price hits the demand curve, we would expect them to voluntarily purchase a unit or units in this market. What about this side of the demand curve? Well, if you look at this side of the demand curve, you'll see that the willingness to pay is less than the price that is being charged. And that means that these consumers would voluntarily abstain from purchasing a unit, right? This would be my grandmother looking at the price of a smartphone, comparing that to the highest price she would be willing to pay, and saying, you know what? No, thank you. I don't want to purchase this product. Okay, so if you get the price just right, you can get the buyers to voluntarily reveal to you who has the highest values, who has the lower values. Okay, and we can make sure that the product gets into the hands of the people who value it the most. What about on the seller side? Well, the price tells the sellers, hey, if you're willing to give up a unit of the good, this is what you'll receive in return for that. Okay, and which sellers are going to be willing to trade at that price? Well, it's going to be the ones whose willingness to accept, or oftentimes their cost of production, is less than the price that they can receive for that cost of production. Now, notice on this segment of the supply curve, the price is greater than the willingness to accept. It's greater than the lowest price that these sellers would sell for. And so all of these sellers along this chunk of the supply curve would voluntarily produce the unit and give it up for sale. But what about these folks on this segment of the supply curve? Well, for them, the price is less than their willingness to accept. Okay? They would lose money on a transaction at this price, and so they would voluntarily say, no, thank you, we're not going to produce these units. Okay? Notice that if only these buyers purchase and only these sellers produce, then you are getting the optimal level of output. Okay, and everybody you want to consume a unit is going to get one. Everybody you want to produce a unit is going to do that. Everybody else voluntarily says, we're going to sit this one out. So if a market can get the price exactly right, the market can capture all of the available gains from trade. And in the next video, we're going to talk about why it is that markets do a pretty good job of setting the price exactly right.